Thank you, Estelle, so much for joining us and being willing to be our first person today and traveling in from Chicago to join us. You have just so much to try to tell us in a short period, so we'll start right away. You were just 10 in Warsaw when World War II began with Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Before we turn to all that would happen to you and your family during the war and the Holocaust, start first with just a little bit about your family and you and your life before the war began.
I was born in Warsaw, Poland, to a middle-class family. In my selective memory, Warsaw glows in radiance of lilac trees against open blue skies, rich sounds of good neighbors, fabulous cousins and family, kindness and trust and love.
Mm-hmm. Estelle, from what you've told me and what I read in your book, your father, you were extremely close to your father. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, my father was a very nurturing, a very, our parents imprint themselves on us. And my father taught me my values, taught me to trust, taught me to love. He taught me to embrace all of humanity, and that trust, that love, that foundation helped me survive whole with love and compassion and joy of life. Life should be lived joyfully.
And your mother, she had fled from violence and anti-Semitism in her native Russia, hadn't she?
My mother reflected the history of Jewish people. Persecution is not new to Jewish people. Jewish people were chased from pillar to post. 1 year they were welcomed and started life, and the next year they were kicked out. And my mother was raised in a shtetl in a small town in Russia, and she was kicked out during World War I, and I came to Poland, and she came with, also taught me compassion, and even though she was persecuted, she would tell us that the Russian people were very suffering people. So she was also very compassionate and loved nature and passed that on to us too.
When Germany invaded Poland, September 1st, 1939, starting World War II, Warsaw was attacked that very day. What do you remember of that first day and then of the siege of Warsaw that followed?
So the sad thing for that day was that the people in Poland were aware that we were threatened. We heard about the aggression, the Nazi aggression, the invasion of the Sudetenland, and we felt that we were so prepared for war, yet war was an abstraction. Mm-hmm. And the very first day, it was a very peaceful, beautiful day, and suddenly there was this tremendous explosion, as though all the air was sucked out of the world. The earth trembled, and then there was silence, and then sirens, and we turned on the radio, and we heard the announcement that bombs were dropped on Warsaw, and that we were at war without declaring war. And in a few seconds, I changed from being a child to being an adult and carrying the burdens that war puts on children.
Still, Warsaw held out for a full month following the German invasion of Poland. You wrote that after the German army marched into Warsaw on October 1st, 1939, immediately my life changed beyond imagination. Tell us about those changes.
Well, I turned 10 when Germany invaded Poland. Immediately, my life changed beyond recognition. My once peaceful streets were now patrolled by foreign soldiers. They shouted insults and cruelty. They snapped whips in our homes and streets. They isolated us in a tiny ghetto and built a thick wall around us. They filled the ghetto with people driven out from surrounding areas. Most people came on foot, most without a penny in their pockets, many without shoes on their feet. Most died of cold and hunger and typhus in the streets. People covered the bodies of their children with posters saying, "Our children must live. Children are the holiest things." Yet in this inferno, people fought heroically to hold on to their values, to hold on to the meaning that was most essential to us. To own a book was an act of defiance, was considered a capital crime. Yet all over the ghetto, people had secret libraries.
And your father was one of them, right?
Books. Yes, my father had a stash of his favorite books by Yiddish authors, by Sholem Aleichem and Sholem Asch and Leb Peretz, Nights, Windows Blinded with Covers, to keep our existence secret in a small room, illuminated by a carbide light. We had no electricity. My father would pull out the stash of his books and read to us, bringing to life remote worlds. We even had theaters. I didn't mention that the Jewish community immediately organized itself into a widespread self-aid center and to support and help the neediest among us. And the self-aid center supported theaters. Theaters, imagine theaters when we had no bread. There was a wonderful author and historian in the Warsaw Ghetto. His name was Chaim Kaplan, and he said that it is remarkable when we don't seem to need it at all. We need poetry more than we need bread. And it is true. I think our souls need to be nourished too. I think our ability to express ourselves, to think for ourselves, is our godliness. Guns hovering over our heads did not stop us from celebrating holidays. We pulled the window shades down and we celebrated. All over the ghetto, heroic teachers met with children in little rooms and taught them to hold on to their imaginations and trust in love. And
all of that, the theater and the poetry, was all done clandestinely.
It was all done at the risk. It was a capital crime.
Offense, yep.
Capital offense, yes.
In the ghetto, there was a large wall built around the ghetto to enclose you. Will you say a little bit about that?
Well, imagine that your horizon is closed, that you are imprisoned, and there is really much more to say than how terribly undignified this form of life was.
I was
yes.
I was struck, Estelle, by something you wrote. You wrote that children followed adult examples to resist barbaric laws. In our complex, apartment complex, there was no child over 10 who did not have some public duty. Will you say more about that?
Yes. Well, we are shaped by our community. And as I pointed out, that there was tremendous moral resistance, and children model their behavior of adults. We hid our books under our clothes, never, now I recognize what a heroic act it was. But we as children did not give it a second thought. But we did walk by, we knew if we were caught or we would be shot, our parents would be shot, and so would our teachers. And children volunteered, and we put on, in my book I describe how children collected clothes and food and put on shows and raised money for needier children. So there was a tremendous moral resistance and holding on to one's soul. Another interesting thing about the ghetto was, I don't recall, if I may be incorrect, but I think we were allowed like 81 calories a day, but I am not sure about the number. But I know that it was less than 10% of the required minimum daily calorie need. And there was smuggling. We weren't completely enclosed by the wall, and there was a curfew, and we were constantly watched. But yet there was smuggling. And children no older than 8 or 10-year-old kids would remove rocks, bricks from the wall and do smuggling. And the wall, of course, was stained with blood. If the child was caught, there was nothing. But if he managed to get through, there was food home for the day. There was also there was also a larger scale smuggling, and that was done by bribery, and the Nazi guards filled their pockets with bribery, and so there was some trade, some black market trade in the ghetto that was going on.
How you were able to survive.
And this is how we were able to survive, many of us, and most were not.
The Nazis started deporting large numbers of Jews out of Warsaw to death in concentration camps in 1942. For a period of time, your family was able to avoid being deported. How were your parents able to manage to keep you from being taken by the Nazis, and how did you survive during that time of all those deportations?
In July 1942, the month of my 13th birthday, the infamous deportations of the Warsaw Ghetto began. We had no idea that the deportations meant death. We were told that we were to be resettled. Some Jewish people were even forced to write false letters to their families, inviting them to places where they were fed and sheltered and taken care of. So you can imagine that many destitute people marched willingly and unknowingly to death. Many people hid. Well, Warsaw was an ancient city, and most people lived in apartment buildings. So where does one hide in an apartment building? Pretty much where children play hide and go seek. We hid behind couches, people hid under beds, they hid in cupboards, they hid in drawers, they hid wherever they could vanish from sight. My family, we obscured one room by putting a wardrobe in front of the door. While we were hiding, between July 1942 and September 1942, in a mere 2 months, 99% of the children disappeared. Can you imagine a world without the sound of children, without the presence of grandmothers and grandfathers, because old people and children were the first to be killed? I was among the 1% of children still alive. And we never heard from the people who were dragged away. But a few people managed to come under the cover of the night back to the ghettos, and they told us about these horrendous train rides to a place called Treblinka, where our people were guests. It is so hard for me to imagine that anyone who loves their mothers and fathers and children can do such a horrendous thing. This is why I'm here to share this story, and I believe that this is why you are all here, because we have to be reminded from time to time that human beings are capable of such utter cruelty, and in the recognition, appreciate so much more the value and the importance of love.
Still, as you just said, 99% of the children were gone. The Nazis had essentially decreed that children under the age of 14 were useless to them.
Yes.
You were 13.
I was 13. Yeah. And I asked my father, what will happen if they come after me? Because I was contraband, forbidden to exist. And my father said, well, if they come after you, I'll burn their eyes out with acid. I won't let them take you away from me. I believed him that I was safe, if only in his love.
At some point, Estelle, you and your family were still in the ghetto. It had been divided, I think, in 1943 into 3 sub-ghettos.
Yes.
And you went to work in a German factory. Will you tell us about that?
Okay. So, nobody, there were just a few Jewish people who were allowed to exist. And they were classified as the useful ones, and the others were contraband, were forbidden to exist. And of course they hid between us, among us, and they were called the wild ones. Now at that point, the ghetto, most of the people were deported. The deportations were carried out with 20th century know-how and Stone Age values. People disappeared in tremendous numbers every day. I think towards the end was like 2,000 people a day. And so I forgot the question.
You were forced to go to work in a German factory, yeah.
So the people who were legal, a very small number, were employed in there were 3 sub-ghettos. So the ghetto was virtually deserted. It was like a haunted place. It was so quiet. I remember we lived in an apartment building. We were the only family in the entire apartment building still alive. I would sometimes walk out into the courtyard and open the gate and listen, hoping that I would hear a sound of life, of a neighbor, of a friend. And the silence was so palpable, it was crawling at us. Now the people, there were 3 sub-ghettos, and the people who were allowed to live, the useful ones, worked in a factory. My mother, sister, and I were fortunate enough to work gratis, without any pay. That was a privilege because it gave you were legally alive. And so we worked in one of those shops, mending uniforms.
German uniforms, mending German uniforms. As the ghetto was being liquidated, or more and more deportations, and it was emptying out, your family moved and created a bunker on the ground floor. Tell us about that.
Now, at the point when the remainder of the people became aware of Treblinka, they began to organize themselves to armed resistance. At that point, organizing yourself in armed resistance made sense. And so they built a network of bunkers. My father was a member of the underground. We moved from our apartment building, our apartment on the 2nd floor to the ground floor so that we could build a bunker too. So they built a network of bunkers, and they also dug tunnels between the bunkers for navigation. They also built a tunnel under the wall in order to get to the Christian side and get arms from the Christian underground. They also used the sewer. The sewer was a very useful means of communication. And so we had a bunker too. The entrance to our bunker had to be, of course, secret. So the trapdoor was the powder room floor with lift, commode, and all, and we would...
All under the commode.
Right, and our existence would be in this netherworld. And
once the Warsaw Uprising began, which was an extraordinary event, there you were hidden away. What was it like for you in the bunker? What was that like?
So in April 1943, events erupted with Nazi columns entering Warsaw with tanks and armored cars and flocks of bomber planes, and with humongous loudspeakers announcing that we better all report for resettlement. Of course, we knew what resettlement meant. So when we heard that, we lifted our trapdoor, went down that flimsy ladder into the dismal basement, pulled the trapdoor down. I felt abandoned. The ceiling pressed down on me. The damp floor walls closed in on me. The flickering of the carbide light was our substitute for the sun. The ticking of the clock was our only clue when morning was rising and night was falling. The few people in the bunker with us was my home nation. And while we were in that bunker, fighting broke out in the street, facing a 20th century army, armed from head to toe, facing armored cars, tanks, bomber planes, was a handful of poorly armed, poorly clad, poorly fed freedom fighters. They climbed up on rooftops. They stepped in front of open windows, climbed out of the bunkers, faced the tanks and bombs falling, incendiary bombs. And what is remarkable, that it took that the freedom fighters, that handful of fighters, fought longer than it took France or Poland to capitulate.
You shared with me that when the edict was given to abolish the ghetto, it was to be done in 3 days as a gift to Hitler for his birthday, and it took 30 days. It took a month to accomplishment.
Right, right. In January 1943, there were a few skirmishes between the deportations were resumed, but the freedom fighters put on a fight, and they fought for 4 days, and the Germans were completely unprepared for it, and so they withdrew, and Himmler promised Hitler that for his birthday he would deliver within 3 days. The present would be to cleanse Warsaw of all Jewish people. So it was cleansed in 3 days.
How were you found, Estelle, when because you were in the bunker, but eventually you were found?
At some point, a grenade was thrown at our the ceiling over us, and we were dragged out. At that point, there was no place to hide anymore. They dragged us out into the street. The buildings were crumbling to our feet. Flames, enormous tongues of flames, were licking the sky and painting it in otherworldly colors of iridescence, plumes of smoke, and they dragged us to Umschlagplatz. We did not march like a flock of, like a swarm of nameless people. We were people with dreams, people with hope. Children sometimes ask me, how did you feel inside? And I tell them that I felt no different than they feel or my grandchildren feel. I too wanted to catch a ball flying in the air. I too wanted to feel the damp grass under my feet. I too wanted to take my family and my friends for granted, as all people should. And they marched us to Umschlagplatz, and congealed blood, people in congealed blood all around us, and loaded us onto freight trains.
And from there you would go to Majdanek.
To Majdanek.
Tell us about going to Majdanek and about your father.
Well, Majdanek, we arrived in the morning after a night drive, ride in the car, in a train, freight train. They were pelting just for the sport bullets into the cars, dead people all around us. Majdanek, the thorns of electrified barbed wire fences marked the end of our horizon. In front of us was the crematorium and the chimneys and the smoke and the stench of human flesh. And if that wasn't enough, in the assembly field there was a gibbet from which, a gallows from which our people were hanging. And my father was guest there. My mother, sister, and I was 13. My sister was 14 and a half years old. My father was guest. My mother was the only mother that I am aware of. We were the only family of 3 people, which made us very, very fortunate, because everyone else, as far as I know, was alone. And my mother, sister, and I survived Majdanek by a fluke of luck. My sister was beaten very badly, and she was put on a list. Our assumption was that her name on the list indicated that she was to go to the guest chambers. The 3 of us had a pact that if one of us would be guest, all 3 of us would go. It was more frightening to us to be separated than facing death. I know for me, my feeling was that I didn't understand what death was, but I wanted so much. My biggest dream at that point was to make the transition to death, holding on to my mother's hand and my sister's hand. And so the only logical thing was for my mother and me to trade places with 2 other women who hoped to see another sunrise. And the following day, when the names were called, my sister's name, and then the names of the 2 other women, my mother and I reported with a group of people, and absolutely sure that we are being walked to the guest chamber, but instead we were loaded onto a freight train and taken to a Skarzysko, there was a distinction between an extermination camp and slave labor camp. An extermination camp was a factory of killing people. A slave labor camp, people also died, but from extreme labor, lack of food. Skarzysko, the slave labor camps also were enclosed by electrified barbed wire fences and towers with guards and dogs, German shepherds. To this day, I'm afraid of dogs, and lights that followed every step that we took.
Let me ask you one more question about Majdanek. I believe it was at Majdanek. You had a photograph of your father.
Yes.
Tell us what happened.
When we were unloaded of the freight trains and marched, I was sure that we were going to the guest chambers. We were given the soap, and we were had to go through showers. The showers did smell of disinfectant. We were sure that it was that. We didn't scream, we didn't cry, not because, you know, it's almost like people when they face, when you have an incurable illness, you want to make your death, you want to face your death with dignity. I didn't cry because I didn't want to really show my tears to my enemies or to my punishers. I didn't cry because I wanted to protect my mother and sister. So I digressed. And so when we were marched to the showers, not knowing whether we're sure also that we'll be guests, I still had our clothes on and shoes. I had one treasure left, which was a photograph of my father that I hid in the lining of my shoe. I was a 13-year-old girl, and this soldier stopped me and he said, "What are you hiding?" I said, I'm not hiding anything. He says, "I know you're hiding something." So I thought, if I'll be truthful, I'll have the best chance of saving the photograph of my father. So I said yes. And I showed him the photograph, and he confiscated it.
From there, as you said, you were sent to Skarzysko. There was an incident on your way to Skarzysko. Tell us about that. You were in the train and...
Random luck. When we were on the freight trains transported from Majdanek to Skarzysko, my sister had to go to the bathroom. So at some point there was a pit stop. And my mother and I pleaded with my sister, "Oh, don't go because they might shoot you," because they were the soldiers, and just shooting for the fun in the air or who knows at home. But my sister said, "I have to go," so we didn't want to part, and we went with her. Then they started to shoot and to chase us into the train. And we ran to the train, but we entered a different car. And Skarzysko had 3 different camps. And one camp, it was armament factory where bullets were being produced. And one camp, they were working on gunpowder, which settled on the lungs and in the skin. And the people who ended up in that particular camp lived only like a month or at most 2 months, because they suffocated from the gunpowder. Because we ran to the train, to the different train than we originally were.
Which was by accident.
By accident, we ended up in that camp that did not work on gunpowder. So that too was one of the random events that accounted for our survival.
From what you've told us already today, from what you wrote about, it's just such an understatement to say that your mother was a remarkable woman.
Yes.
There was an incident where she confronted one of the guards, which I think was instrumental in saving your sister's life.
Well, not really.
Okay.
Not really. It was just that when we were, the camp was located at some distance from the factory. So, of course, we never saw much of the daylight. We worked from early morning till late at night. And you know, in this museum, when you walk out, you'll see that there is a skylight, the ceiling, which is really no accident. I'm digressing here, but it just strikes me because when we were walking, I'm a little bit incoherent, but I'll make sense in a minute. When we were walking from the camp to the factory, all I remember was darkness. And all I remember was the patch of sky. That was my only connection to freedom, to light. And I thought I was the only one who remembered the patch of sky. But the architect who built this museum interviewed survivors, and apparently most of the survivors remembered that patch of sky, and this is why we have this
Here in the museum.
In the museum. So yes, as we were marched on this dark place from work to camp, There were one couple, a Jewish guard. The German maid told him to hit somebody. And my mother stepped out of the line and she said, one Jew does not hurt another Jew. If you touch him, your blood will rise from the grave and you'll never know peace. So she had that my sister and I thought she was absolutely mad. Well, we weren't shot, and so that was my mother's courage, yes.
You're at Skarzysko. You, your sister, and your mother were referred to by the other inmates as the Three Monkeys.
The Three Monkeys.
And you thought about using that as the title of your book at one point. Why did they refer to you as the Three Monkeys?
We were the only family of three in the group. And we survived as one organism. We were covered with lice. We were covered with mange. And we picked lice of one another. So we were just clinging so together. So it was the people and our friends, our Holocaust camp sisters affectionately called us the Three Monkeys.
From Skarzysko, you were then sent to Czestochowa.
To Czestochowa.
And from there you would be liberated.
Yes.
Tell us about your liberation.
So that's January 1943. We were so isolated. That was from September 1939 to January 1943. We were so isolated. We might as well have been on a different planet. We could not imagine that only a few rabbit hops away from us, people were sailing on silver lakes, and children sat around tables with families as children should. And then suddenly, one night, we hear the rumbling of planes, and we hear bombs falling, and we say, could it be? After all these years, could it be? And we were liberated that morning, and that was in the middle of January. Poland is quite cold. The ground was covered with snow and ice. All we had on was a loose kaftan. Amazing how much hunger and starvation and all kinds of abuse human beings can endure and still remain human, because we did survive with love for humanity and compassion and joy of life. And the ground was covered with snow and ice, the wooden clogs, no underwear, freezing, and we shuffled out when we saw the gates were open, which in itself was intoxicating, and the camp was surrounded by a no man's land, and we shuffled out in the ice and listened, and we were so afraid because this was the front line. What if the Nazis, what if the German forces come back? And it was like in a nightmare when you think that you want to run and you cannot move. And we shuffled and ran, and we went out into moved very gingerly, listening. We heard the tanks, we heard sounds of soldiers, listened, and then when we recognized that they were Russian soldiers, and we rushed towards them like one is to meet Messiah. And we ran up to them and we said, oh, do you know how long we've been waiting for you? And they put out a hand and they said, sorry, but we have a war to fight. And indeed they did, because this was January.
January 1945.
For 1945, and the war wasn't over till May. And so they looked at their watches. They gave us a slab of bread. They looked at their watches and they said, you better find shelter before curfew. I don't know at this point if I was more afraid of dying of cold and starvation, or of being put in jail for breaking curfew. So we found shelter in an abandoned school. It was not easy. And from 1945 to 1947, we were stateless and homeless and roaming through Poland. We were not welcome. Many Polish people were afraid that the Jewish people might reclaim their maybe some properties. You know, anti-Semitism and prejudice against any people is not is pretty common everywhere, and which is one of the reasons why this museum exists. This is one of the reasons why I'm here to share my story, to remind myself and all of us that humanity is one. And so we marched through Poland, through Czechoslovakia at that time, through Germany, and eventually came to the United States.
Estelle, I would, there's so much that I wish we had the time for you to tell us, not including what you did during the period you're describing now, but if you don't mind, I would like you to share the incident where early after your liberation and you're trying to make it, you're with your mom and your sister, and your mother buys a single piece of candy.
Oh, well, all of that is in my book. So.
Can you give a sneak preview?
Yeah. Well, we were wandering through Poland first, and it was winter, and there were no DP camps, displaced persons camps. We were completely on our own, not a penny, not a home, to come back to remind me of the question
about
again.
your mother buying a piece of candy. Yeah.
And so we are afraid that we'll be stuck in this country that doesn't want us. We did not want to. My mother had siblings in the United States, so our dream was to somehow establish contact with them and to come here. So we hopped trains, and my mother hopped, and we hopped, and my sister hopped planes and trains, and we went to look for family. And so we were on our way, and we came to a town called Kielce, and there was a market, and we haven't seen that much food, carrots and beets
and you have
and
no money.
Potatoes and no money and candies. And we had maybe, I think we found a few pennies. And we look at all this food, and we are so hungry, and it's glowing, and it's still winter. And my mother says, we have a few cents, and my mother says she'll buy a candy. So my sister and I thought, well, she's going to spend the last penny. We thought, you're out of your mind to buy the candy. So my mother bought the candy, and we shared it, and she said she wanted us to taste the sweetness of life.
And you each shared it.
And we shared it.
We have time for a couple of questions from our audience. But before we do, I just wanted to share something you wrote in your book, if you don't mind. And that's, You wrote, "Our survival depended 99% on random luck and 1% on instinct and grit. Without the 1% pluck, you were 100% dead."
Right.
You've done an incredible job in a short time of helping us understand that. So let's turn to our audience.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you if you would stay with us for a couple of questions, because we're going to end the program with Estelle sharing some final thoughts with us before we do. So please stay with us. We have time for a couple of questions. We have microphones in both aisles. We ask that you take a microphone and then make your question as brief as you can. I'll repeat it just to be sure that we hear it correctly up here, and then Estelle will respond to it. So do we have anybody who would like to ask a question? We have one right down here. I think it's Jocelyn coming down with a microphone. Okay. There we go.
How did you survive as you were traveling in the months immediately after you were liberated? How did you get food?
How did you survive in the months right after liberation? You described how cold it is. How did you make it?
I don't know how we survived, except, like people ask me sometimes, was it hope that kept us alive and going? I guess that there is in all of us a current that wants to live. I know I wanted to live. I felt worthy of living, and I think that this is a beautiful drive in all of us, the current and the love for life.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have another question? I think we have one right here. Yes.
Mrs. Laughlin, I want to say thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. Many of us want our children to know about the horrors of the Holocaust, and we're grateful for this museum. We're grateful for people like you who share their story and remind us of the need of courage and love. And I guess what I want to say is this: is I've heard, I've seen the word random and randomness about the 1%, your survival, about that you didn't get on the train to go to the gunpowder factory. I'm wondering if you've considered that it wasn't random, that God had a plan for you and people like you to survive, to tell the story of the horrors. I would ask that you comment.
Asking for your comment about, despite the comment about randomness, that was there the role of God in your mind in saving you?
I am not a religious person, but I am a very spiritual person. I feel very connected with all living things. My parents were humanists. They were not religious, but very, very connected with all life. I know that many people who held on to religion, to them, religion represented the nobility, the goodness in us. And I don't know how to define the fact that we survived other, that it was really random luck, like when you scatter something on the ground and you'll pick it up, some things will happen to stay there. I don't feel that I was more deserving to survive than others were. I don't think that there's any justification for killing people. For life is sacred, it's noble, and I don't feel that there is any, I cannot explain why, except that I know that it's wrong, that we are all one, and that what any one of us does affects everyone else.
Thank you, Estelle. I think that we're out of time for questions. I'm going to turn back to Estelle in just a moment. Before I do, I'd like to thank you all for being with us. Remind you that we'll have a first-person program each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. We hope that you can come back, but if not, the museum's website will have information about the first-person program in 2018. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word, so I'll turn back to Estelle to do that. Before I do, I just want to let you know that when Estelle's done, our photographer Joel will come up on the stage, and he's going to take a photograph of Estelle with you as the background. So we ask that you stay with us so that we can take that picture of Estelle. I also would like to let you know that, remind you that when Estelle's done, she's going to go up to the doors at the top of the stairs where she'll be available to sign copies of her book, Transcending Darkness, and it has a lot that we weren't able to get to today, I can tell you that. Estelle.
I thank you all so very much for being here. It seldom are people willing to listen or to tell these stories because they generate such pain. Yet we have to be reminded from time to time of the consequences to us and to humanity when we accommodate ourselves to tyrants, how it corrupts the conscience of a nation, what it does to love and what it does to trust. As long as therefore happen, as long as there are people who say that the Holocaust did not happen, in some ways, Majdanek and Auschwitz are still with us. I think I am so grateful for this wonderful museum because the museum proves that history always remembers, and we must listen if civilization is to progress. And thank you again so much for being here.